The other issue, Professor, and you mentioned the case of Ukraine, and we know as the case of Taiwan is so serious for China. But the 12-day war between Iran and Israel, I think that was a huge change or shift in the Middle East, or the perception on the part of the Arab states. Before that, they didn't know. They were, we were somehow aware of the capabilities of Iran, but we haven't seen anything happening, between Iran and Israel. Right now, we know what was that and how effectively Iran has struck Israel. Do you think that could or has brought some sort of changes in the calculation on the part of the Arab states? Or maybe Turkey? You mentioned Turkey getting closer to Iran, but what do they think in your opinion?
That's difficult to say. In the West, I think there is a blindness to reality that won't go away. So right now, I mean, let's go back to the 12-day war. When it started, they thought Iran was going to collapse, and people from the West were contacting me and saying, you know, it's over. I said that was sign that you live in this alternative universe. After the war, they continued to say the same thing, even though sane people know that Iran won. In mainstream, in like their think tanks and in the media, they're still trying to present the Israeli regime as the victor. So they're living in this alternative universe. Right now, as we speak, Iran is, from their narrative, Iran is on the verge of collapse again, and there's a revolution. And what are you going to do about that? They're never going to learn. It's just like the Russians they're losing in Ukraine. The Russians, they're tearing apart the uh, refrigerators or washing machines to
Russians.
take out to take the chips for the. I mean, right now, look at how many missiles they're firing on a daily basis. What happened to that narrative? So for 3.5 years, the Russians were losing. China is always falling and failing, and Iran is always going to be failing and falling. And whenever Iran, and so because that narrative is so powerful there, and it's a part of their ideology because they are exceptional, they are Eurocentric, American, Westocentric, American exceptionalism. So obviously, Iran has to be a regime that's unstable and it won't last because it's not, it's not normal. They are normal. Everyone else is abnormal. So whatever Iran does, they're going to interpret it in that context. So if Iran says we're open for negotiations, they'll say, "See, they're falling apart." They won't see it as a sign that Iran is being normal, that Iran wants to pursue conflict resolution if it's possible. They'll see it as a sign of weakness. Of course, Iran has to say these things because it's also speaking to the global South, the global majority. It's speaking to its own people, saying, "Look, we're the reasonable ones." But the West is always going to interpret it as a sign of weakness, rather than as an opportunity to solve problems. And so, if there are 10 people on the streets, or 100 people on the streets, or 1,000 people on the streets, they're going to say it's over. There's a crisis in Iran. The currency is collapsing. The economy is falling. How many times have we heard that over the last few decades? We're always in crisis. We're always falling apart, but it doesn't happen. There's no accountability and there's no change. So they won't learn from what happens now and rethink 6 months from now. And that's why I say that there isn't a rethink in the West. And I don't know if we can say there's a how deep there's a rethink in the region, because a lot of these elites, they're bound to the West. They get their information about Iran from the West. This is something that I know personally because some of these people I know in Qatar. I know I know a lot of people in Qatar, and we'd have conversations and in their think tanks, and they'd be basically repeating for the most part what Western think tanks would be saying. Even Al Jazeera, when you look at Al Jazeera English, it's very mainstream and Arabic, uh, quite hostile towards the resistance in many ways, differing at times based on the policy determined at the top. English is very different from Arabic as well, but in any case, it's difficult to say. But I do think that there has been a shift. they do see Iran as the the force that's standing up against the Israeli regime and has it remains standing, and they're much more fearful of the Israeli regime than they were before. It's there is this concern that the Emiratis and the Israeli regime want to break up Saudi Arabia, and why wouldn't they? Uh, the expansionist policies are a threat to Egypt, Jordan, of course, and then there's Turkey. Turkey is very vulnerable, especially after the foolish behavior of Erdogan over the last 15 years. Turkey is vulnerable to this coalition that that I just was pointing out, and I think that the reason why President Erdogan is coming to Iran is, of course, the Iranians will be speaking to him about the way in which I speak to him. But anyway, when he comes to Iran, he'll be discussing these issues. So I think it's a yes and no answer to you. In some ways, I think they have changed. In other ways, I think they still are captives of Western narratives.
And you've mentioned the case that Israel is getting closer to, Cyprus and of course, the southern part of Cyprus, because the southern part is under the influence of Greece.
And it's really it's really disgusting that because I've been to Cyprus, I have many Greek friends, and many of them are very hostile towards the Israeli regime. It's very that their government should be ashamed. I mean, regardless of the role that Turkey plays towards Cyprus or towards uh, Greece, but to align oneself with a genocidal, monstrous regime like the Israeli regime is just unacceptable. I mean, the issue, Mr. Erdogan and his support for ISIS and Al Qaeda and terrorism and the destruction of Syria, that aside, but to align with Israel is just, you know, disgraceful.
I think the question would be what Israel want from, these two countries. The southern part of Cyprus, as I know, is a little, island that is not capable of any, but the land can be used. You know,
Yes,
and
and it is.
yeah,
During the war with the 12-day war with Iran, they used Cyprus extensively. The British used Cyprus to help kill Palestinians in Gaza. The British armed forces use it for their own disgraceful reasons. I think that through this coalition, the Israeli regime gains much more than Cyprus and Greece. But here I'm really speculating, and I'm going well beyond my scope of knowledge. But if Ukraine fails, and it will, I mean, I don't know how this is going to end, but Ukraine is going to lose this war. But the worst case scenario, I think, for NATO is for the Russians to take Odessa. And then, as I said earlier, the southeast Europe I think, is going to change politically. The people of Greece are Orthodox Christians, and if Russia is strengthened, then there's a possibility. I'm guessing again. Maybe your Greek viewers would say it's nonsense, but I think that would create a tilt towards Russia, or a potential tilt towards Russia in Greece and in Cyprus. Of course, the state would not like this because they're bound to the West. But I think that could make them feel less reliant or less needy of an alliance with the Israeli regime. Again, this is I don't know how true this is, but if Russia's position strengthens, and Russia is not Iran. I mean, Russia's views on Israel are not the same as Iran's, but Russia is not the West. And Russians, for the overwhelmingly those who I know and those who I've met in Russia in my different trips, they do not like the Israeli regime. And so, if Russia is strengthened in this war, at the end of this war, then I think Greece and Cyprus will probably tilt towards Russia, and I think that's a very good thing.
and how about the negotiations with the United States? I think right now Iran is rethinking or somehow trying to understand how to deal with the United States under the Trump administration because it's not a stable sort of mindset on their part. And you have to deal with it after all because he's the president of the United States. What is the understanding? What is the take of on the part of Iran?
I think it's pretty clear. There's no intention to negotiate. And after the 12-Day War, it was clear. There were some people, some of these young people in Iran who are online, who every time the foreign ministry would say, "We are prepared to negotiate if the other side," and they saw this as like an attempt by Iran to appease the United States. That's not true. I mean, uh, that was not the intention of the government. That's these are those Western narratives where they, they're constantly portraying Iran as weak and vulnerable and so on. The Iranians are always going to say this. They're always going to say that if the other side changes, we even 10, 15, 20 years ago, we've always been saying that if the other side changes its behavior, so and so can happen. But the Iranians have no intention for now to have any change in policy towards the International Atomic Energy Agency. They have no intention of having negotiations with the United States. And they are strengthening their relations with China, with Russia, with other BRICS countries. China and Russia are moving towards Iran. I think they feel also that it's crucial that the United States doesn't gain any ground in our region because the United States is trying. You see it; they're trying to take Venezuela in Latin America. They want to take West Asia. That would leave Russia and China very vulnerable. So they too have a greater incentive to work more closely with Iran. And in a sense, even though sanctions are bad, and you know Iran, the economy is growing, but there's a lot of difficulty. Um, reforms have to take place. Energy reforms, in one form or another, have to take place. And gasoline in Iran costs 1 cent a liter. That causes us to consume huge amounts of gasoline, and a lot of smuggling takes place. You know that electricity is literally free too. I mean, for ordinary Iranians, they see it as that it can be expensive, but compared to other countries, it's really nothing. Or natural gas, which all homes have. Right now, here that you and I are sitting in this studio, it's very warm. Why? Because it's so cheap. They just turn it on and they leave. It's very warm. I shouldn't even you shouldn't even be wearing this. But if it was the proper price, this studio would not do this. Or people at home and they wear t-shirts during winter. Why? Because it's so cheap. So that energy reform has to take place, and so there are many problems in Iran. But I think the sanctions have, in some ways, helped Iran not only become more independent and to develop its own industry, but also they're pushing Iran towards the future because the future is Asia. And if the West had not pushed us away, we would have remained complacent about the future. And so, in the short term, in the midterm, it's hurt us significantly, no doubt about it. But I think in the long term, it is pushing us towards the future and towards Asia. And so, you see the North South Transport Corridor being built just today. President Pezeshkian spoke to President Putin again. Obviously, that's a central theme. And the Belt and Road Initiative is being pursued by Iran and China. So I think that in the long term, with the decline of the dollar and the rise of alternative means to carry out commerce without Western financial institutions being able to block it, I think Iran will be well ahead of many other countries that have not been sanctioned.
In President Pezeshkian was talking about the situation with that Iran is experiencing with the United States, Europe, and Israel. He said that we are practically at war, but the main message of his sort of argument was that they're doing everything to be at war with us.
And then the Western media, they just simply lie. And they said that he is saying that they translate it as if he's saying that we're declaring war on the West.
Exactly.
They know they're lying, but that's what they've been doing ever since I was a teenager. I mean, for me, this is if the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Los Angeles Times or the Guardian or Sky News or CNN or Fox News, if they or the BBC or anyone else, France 24, whoever, if they represented Iran in a reasonable way, I would be shocked. Even if I saw a single, I it never happens. I mean, there may be some slight differences in tone, but fundamentally it's the same. Their depiction of Iran is a dystopia where life is miserable and people are all miserable and women are miserable and young people are all miserable and everyone hates the regime. But they fail to tell us why, when General Soleimani is murdered, you have millions of people on the streets. They fail to tell us when President Raisi passed away, why so many people came to the streets. They fail to so they sort of ignore this. They report it sort of, not the real. They don't show they'll say thousands of people participated. Whereas millions are there. But if there are 100 people or 50 people protesting against the government, they'll say the Iranian people are against the regime. They're not going to change. So yes, what President Pezeshkian said is that the West is basically at war with us, and we are living under these circumstances. But they said they translated it as if he was saying we're at war with them.
The amazing thing about you know the attitude on the part of Europeans, they've lost Russia, and they're in the process of losing China and Iran. And what is your understanding on Europe today and the way that they're behaving toward Europe?
About 4 years ago, I went with the nuclear negotiating team to Vienna. I went with Dr. Zarif in 2015, and then 4 years ago, I went with Dr. Balgadi. And during that period, during the negotiations, the war began in Ukraine. The Russian, the proxy war began. And they were in the middle of the negotiations. And I was telling politicians and key Western journalists and these elites in our private conversations that you need Iran now. You are moving towards an era of darkness, a dark winter, because you are going to cut off gas from Russia, and this is not going to it's not going to go back to normal for years after this war. And they were all saying, and when I say all, I'm not exaggerating. Everyone was saying more or less that no, this war will last a few weeks. Russia will be defeated. Putin will have to step down. And I was saying, I don't see that happening. I think the Russians will win this war. I actually thought it would happen sooner, but I thought it would last a couple of years at most. But in any case, I said Russia will win this war, and you need gas, and you will not have Russian gas. And you need a nuclear deal with Iran to have Iranian gas so you can invest in Iran. And winter is approaching for Europe. The European winter is approaching. And now it's been 4 years. And the industrialization continues. Europe has isolated itself from Russia, from the United States, or at least the Trump regime, from China, from Iran. Okay, so what do you have left? What do you have left? Nothing. And so Europe is becoming irrelevant. They're becoming a force of no, and they try to use foolishly the um, trigger mechanism in the nuclear deal, which the Russians and the Chinese said we're not going to accept it, and we're not going to accept the revival of the UN sanctions. So they used this tool against Iran, but what happened ultimately? It made them irrelevant to Iran because it was the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, that gave the Europeans a special status to be able to negotiate with Iran. Now Iran says, we're not talking with you anymore. We don't care about you anymore. If at some point we're going to talk about the nuclear program in the years to come, we'll speak to the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese. Who are you to be a part of the negotiating process? So they've basically, on all fronts, made themselves irrelevant, and I think it's going to get a lot worse.